rules were circulated to members last week. I asked for unanimous consent that the proposed rules be considered read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any questions before we begin the amendment process?
It's colloquy first.
Please.
Are you going to do the colloquy first? Yes. Okay.
Mr. Bishop?
Thank you. Took that long to recognize me, huh? I'm the same person. I've worn the suit before.
I told you it's a different view. I don't know what to do.
I am pleased that the first thing we're going to do is enter into a colloquy with Chairman Grijalva, if he will join me in this colloquy, that regards certain committee practices. For future reference, I want you to know I'm going to be reading this colloquy so you can realize how damn dull reading stuff in here actually is. Earlier this month, I approached Chairman Grijalva with suggestions for a draft committee rule for the 116th Congress. While he declined to amend the rules directly, he did graciously, and I'll emphasize that word, agree that the committee would follow these procedures. 1, when received by the appropriate clerk, testimony would be shared immediately with the minority staff. This was a practice followed by EMR subcommittee in the previous Congress. 2, information shall be made available to all members before oversight and investigative hearings, not just legislative hearings. This will be very important given that we understand Chairman Grijalva will not be continuing our former practice of providing a background memo to all members of the committee and posting it online. 3, and finally, the ranking member would be notified immediately before a unilateral subpoena is issued. Can the chair confirm that the committee will follow these practices during the 116th Congress?
Thank you, Mr. Bishop, and thank you for reaching out to discuss these priorities and ideas. Policy differences aside, we'll make every effort to ensure that we communicate fairly and promptly with the minority. This includes sharing witness statement testimony as it comes in, giving notice before a unilateral subpoena is issued, and provide information about oversight and investigative hearings, not just legislative hearings, as the rule states. We'll do that, and I appreciate your offer to work on those 3, and we're more than willing to work on those and make sure that our commitment to in this discussion is followed through by all. Give me mine. 10 amendments, thank you. Continuing, 10 amendments were filed last night. They were circulated electronically. The first amendment is a manager's amendment offered by myself. The manager's amendment clarifies that generation and marketing of electronic power from federal water projects by federally chartered or federal regional power marketing authorities and rights of way over public lands for energy-related transmission fall under the jurisdiction of the Energy and Mineral Resources Subcommittee. That's 1. The amendment also restores the oath to its original form, which I know Mr. Graves will support with enthusiasm, and thank you. Thank the gentleman from Louisiana for pointing out the need for that correction. It's been made, and that mistake was not sinister, nefarious, or anti-spiritual. It was a mistake, and it's corrected, and this amendment would correct that, and Mr. Gale.
Mr. Chair, what does this have to do with the red stamper? I'm just curious.
Only if you want God to be there. If I can be recognized, and then I'll yield. I appreciate the chairman and staff making these changes in this manager's amendment. We support it. Let me yield to Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Mr. Chairman, I just want to say thank you. You and I spoke about this on the floor. I appreciate you taking a look at this. I appreciate the correction. And so I just want to say thank you very much for doing that. I quickly want to make note that I do hope that no one here brushes this issue under the rug and does continue to pay attention to this. Look, this place is unbelievable, and it's incredible how divisive this place is. And I am a sinner. I make mistakes every single day. Don't need any comment from the peanut gallery over there, Mr. Huffman. I guess it would have come from you. You're right. You're right. No, but I do think that we could use a little bit more of God, not less. All of us. I get concerned about the thought that we're not making an oath to something that's higher, something that's bigger, something that is above us. We all just took the oath by the speaker just a few weeks ago, where these very words were said, and we did affirm our oath. And certainly not here to discuss church and state, but I do think it's important to note that our founders clearly had much faith in something above, in God, and I just want to say again, I want to thank you very much for correcting the error. I do appreciate it, and I just hope that everyone does take this seriously, coming from an imperfect sinner.
Would the gentleman yield?
Mr. Bishop's time.
Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I appreciate the gentleman's sincerity and respect his faith choices. I actually think that including these trappings of religion is constitutionally dubious. I think folks who may have a personal objection with that really have a beef with some of our founders like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, who felt strongly that faith and government are both enhanced when they are kept separate from each other. And I strongly agree with that. I would also note that all of these trappings of religion and God in these oaths certainly have not kept an awful lot of people from lying under oath. If you look at the inner circle of the Trump administration, for example, all those folks raised their hand and cited the Bible and all of these religious elements and proceeded to lie. And one by one, they're being convicted of perjury and lying to Congress. One thing that does seem to put the fear of God in them is Special Counsel Mueller. And so I would just suggest, half seriously, that if it's getting truthful testimony that we want in an oath, we should probably include a phrase that subjects their testimony to immediate review by Special Counsel Mueller. With that, I think we're going to proceed to continue this practice, even though I think it's on dubious constitutional grounds. I understand that my concern about it is probably the minority view will continue doing it, but I will stand with the founders, the deists, and the humanists who felt that religion and government should be kept strictly separate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate what's being said. I appreciate the bipartisan spirit. But the reason this raised a lot of eyebrows is because it's not just this committee. Yesterday, as committees were meeting in our Judiciary Committee, Chairman Nadler swore in witnesses and did not include the phrase. I'm told OGR, it didn't happen in that committee either. Perhaps that's just an oversight, but I hope that we can correct that oversight, because more than just being religious trappings, this is part of the fabric of who we are as Americans. And this is not the place to debate all that, and I know that you're not teeing that up. But I want to say this. You quoted Jefferson. If we walk a few blocks and we go to the Jefferson Memorial, it's inscribed on the wall what he said. God, who gave us life, gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. So we do owe our allegiance, we owe our authority to a higher power. It's been recognized since the Founders' era. The Judiciary Act of 1789 has made every Supreme Court justice and every lower federal court and other judge throughout the country take the oath under God. The naturalization oath that new citizens take includes the phrase, and my goodness, we ought to include it here for our witnesses as well. So I'm grateful for the manager's amendment. I hope that we remember our traditions, and I hope that these oversights and all the other committees as well can be corrected so that we maintain this important part of who it is to be an American. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Chair.
Be recognized. Mr. Go.
Yeah,
Who else? Sir?
thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate, again, the bipartisan nature of this, but we did have that occur yesterday in Judiciary. But I go back to our very founding, and if you go over to the State Department and look at an original copy of the Treaty of Paris 1783, I was shocked by the words in huge print before the rest of the treaty. This is the one that asked England to swear under oath that we were going to be allowed to be independent. And when you look at it in that context, what would you ask somebody to swear in if you're an American back in 1783 and you find the only words in huge print were, "In the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity"? I was shocked that was there. I'm majored in history, I hadn't seen that. But mention of deists, some people were called deists like Ben Franklin, but if you look at the words we know he spoke at the Constitutional Convention, we know because he wrote it out. Madison made notes, but he wrote out the whole speech right after when he was asked. But his own words were, and he was 80, he was a couple of years or so away from meeting his maker, but I've lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth. God governs in the affairs of men, and if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it possible an empire could rise without his aid? He said, we've been assured, sir, in the sacred writing, that unless the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. And so, anyway, it is part of our beginning, and some of us believe it could lead to our end if we neglect the source of our blessings, that Jefferson, Franklin, so many that are attributed as being godless were anything but. But I appreciate the time, and I appreciate the change.
I'm keenly aware of the member schedule demands right now. So if there's general agreement, I'd like to move to a vote. But first, Mr. Vandrew and Mr. Cunningham are asked to talk.
Just quickly, I had the pleasure, my father and mother, my first name is Jefferson. So I had to learn a lot about Thomas Jefferson growing up. And while he didn't believe we should have to believe in any particular religion, the Church of England or any other religion, he certainly did believe in a God, in a supreme being, and that we should abide by the knowledge of that supreme being and understanding that it does no harm. And certainly I think that we all could do well if perhaps we were a little bit, again, whatever religion, whatever faith, or even if you don't believe in anything, just emulated what is in many of the good religions that surround us. And I thank the chairman for doing this. I think it's hurtful and harmful to go out of our way to take it out. I don't see the point of that. But Jefferson was clear. He believed in God. He believed that there was a faith. But he didn't believe that you should be forced to believe in it, even if you were an atheist. And he didn't believe that you should be forced to adopt any particular religion. That doesn't mean that you don't believe in God.
Very briefly, I just want to commend the chair for putting "So Help Me God" back in to the oath. And I would just echo what my colleague, Mr. Graves, had said earlier, and my colleague, Mr. Vandrew, as well. Just echo their sentiments, and thank you for inserting that back in.
Sir, we're trying, with your indulgence, members are going to start leaving, and we're going to miss the opportunity on some amendments. Sir.
I will be brief, thank you. But, while we're talking about Jefferson and Franklin, the most famous document they wrote was probably the Declaration of Independence. And in that Declaration of Independence, it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That is the foundational freedoms of our country. And Franklin and Jefferson, neither one had a problem appealing to a higher being in those writings. I yield back.
We have, would any other, Mr. McClintock, you raised your hand?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate what the chair has done, but I have sat here and I've listened to some things that as an ordained Baptist minister that I just can't remain quiet on. Number one, the Bible tells us not to swear to begin with. That's why I always take an affirmation. Number two, you talk about Jefferson and all of our founders, yet they managed to overlook African Americans as 2/3 of or 3/4 of a person. That's not godlike. So don't give me Jefferson, don't give me the founders. They were good men, doing the best they could under the circumstances, but they certainly weren't acting Christ-like. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And Hearing no further debate.
Mr. Chairman,
The question is on the.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry, please. Just what, I'm confused. I know I got in late. I apologize. Is the question to put in "so help you God" or to take it out?
Leave it in.
To leave it in. So the question is, do we leave it in?
Yeah,
Got it.
no problem. Hearing no further debate again. The question is on adoption of the manager's amendment, and I hope we've established that no one side is more godly than the other during this discussion, and that whomever you pray, whomever your higher power is okay. With that, let me ask for all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. All those opposed? The ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is passed. The next amendment is number 1, filed by Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, you're recognized first to offer your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just want to clarify that this is the amendment that was included within the manager's. Okay. Mr. Chairman, so once again, I just want to thank you. Obviously, with our amendment being included within the manager's, I don't think we need to double state it.
Okay.
But I want to say again, thank you very much for working with us. Mr. Huffman, I tried really hard to not to keep my comments kind of level and not go sliding down. I'm gonna continue to do that. I just want to make note, and we can have our pastor here share some scripture with us. But if we want to go down the list of Republicans and Democrats that have been convicted or perjured, we could do that, and certainly embarrassment on both sides of the aisle. And so I think that there is a story in the Bible about casting the first stone, and I just want to say that I think we made the right decision, that I appreciate once again the chairman's activities, and I am withdrawing the amendment.
The amendment is withdrawn, thank you. And the next amendment is for consideration, is designated as McClintock number 1. Mr. McClintock, you're recognized to offer your amendment, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would continue an important anti-corruption policy followed by the Natural Resources Committee in recent years to assure that Indian water rights settlements are based on the law and not on political whim. As you know, a settlement's an agreement between parties in lieu of litigation. This occurs when a defendant recognizes that the cost of the settlement would be less than the likelihood of an adverse verdict. That's a legal judgment based on an assessment of the facts and the application of the law. Litigation is a uniquely executive function, but approving a settlement is a legislative one. The problem we ran into was that Congress was proposing and negotiating and agreeing to settlements with, I don't know how to put this politely, politically friendly tribes, even when our lawyers and their agencies believed the government was in the right and would prevail in court. This did a tremendous disservice to taxpayers by giving away the store to litigants who were filing meritless lawsuits but happened to have doting friends in Congress. I objected to this practice on the House floor on January 20th, 2010, and I'd ask unanimous consent to include that speech in the committee record today.
Without objection?
So to combat this practice, the Natural Resources Committee implemented a policy to assure that settlements were only considered once our lawyers and the affected parties had agreed to the lawsuit, that it had merit, and that they agreed that it ought to be settled outside of court to save taxpayers the still higher costs if the matter went to trial. This amendment codifies this policy, which has been successfully applied to approve a number of settlements over the last few years. Specifically, it provides that before an Indian water rights settlement is considered or recommended by the Natural Resources Committee, that the Departments of Interior and Justice and the plaintiffs all agree to the settlement, that the departments certify that it doesn't duplicate claims previously paid, that it doesn't pay meritless claims, and that it's in the best interest of the taxpayers to approve the settlement rather than to go to trial.
Thank you, Mr. McClintock. Would any other member like to be recognized on this amendment? Ms. Holland?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I claim time in opposition to the amendment. And first, I'd like to say that we are on Indian land. The proposed amendment imposes needless red tape and burdensome requirements on this committee's ability to approve Indian water rights settlements. In essence, the amendment gives veto power to the Department of Justice, the Department of the Interior, and the Office of Management and Budget by requiring these agencies to sign off on a settlement before this committee is allowed to approve a settlement bill. This is an irresponsible abdication of Congress's authority to approve Indian water rights settlements. It's also an abdication of this committee's trust responsibility to Indian tribes. Indian water rights settlements are an essential part of the federal Indian trust responsibility, as I stated. This committee must meet our responsibility to provide water to Indian country regardless of whether certain executive branch officials sign off on a settlement. Furthermore, this amendment simply makes it harder to enact Indian water rights settlements, which provide the funding necessary to build adequate water infrastructure that provides clean water and basic services to tribes. And if anyone visits any number of tribes in our country right now, you would see that it is in a dire state. According to recent data from the Indian Health Service, nearly half of all homes on tribal land don't have access to adequate drinking water and sewage facilities. This contributes to disproportionately high rates of mortality, hampered economic development, and needless suffering for tribal families across the nation. And while I understand my colleagues' concern about the cost, the fact is that Indian water rights settlements pay for themselves many times over. In addition to settling expensive legal claims against the United States, settlements provide numerous additional cost savings. For example, IHS, the Indian Health Service, has found that for every dollar spent on water supply and sewage facilities, there is at least a 20-fold return in health benefits achieved in Indian country. In short, I cannot support this amendment because it undermines this committee's authority and hinders the approval of Indian water rights settlements, which save taxpayer money and provide much-needed water to Indian country. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Anyone else would like to?
Yep.
Mr. Bishop.
Look, we're making a big deal about this, and a lot of these arguments, I'm sorry, just don't fit the reality. Justice and Interior have a veto over this, whether we say so or not, whether we want to or not. And because of the earmark rules, which haven't been changed, we could not have passed any of the Indian water rights legislation over the past year. We did 3 of them. The goal of this was to try and get around the earmark rule, which hasn't changed at all, and to recognize that because Justice and Interior will have to sign off on anything, what we pass without that is ridiculous. It's useless. This is not an effort to limit the power. It's actually an effort to try and make things expeditious and get something done. So if we pass something, it's not just going to be a nice little pie in the sky, big speech kind of concept. It's actually going to be doable because these other entities that do already and will continue to have veto power will have the ability of signing off on it ahead of time. So that's why it was an effort to get around the earmark rule last time. It's the wise thing to do. I'd urge you actually to continue it. It will expedite our process.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Anyone else like to be recognized? Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to ask a quick question just for clarification purposes. Mr. Chairman, if you read paragraph 2 and paragraph 4, paragraph 2 says both departments and the parties have approved in writing the legislative text needed to codify the settlement. And number 4 says that the departments specifically support the authorization. Mr. Chairman, I want to certainly give some degree of input to the federal agencies, but this appears to almost be a contingency and would violate at least my standards of our separation. I am not going to operate only in the direction that a department recommends. I just want to ask the sponsor if you could clarify the intent of those two.
Again, this codifies what we have been doing for many years, and that is that the department as our attorney comes to us and says, we need to settle this. It will be a far better benefit to the taxpayers than trying to take this to trial. And here is the language that we have worked out with the litigants that will consummate the settlement and prevent this from having to go to trial. And again, this is nothing new. We applied this principle to Indian water rights settlements for many years, first informally, more recently formally, and this simply puts it into the rules.
Gentleman
Yield
yields
back.
back. Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on this amendment? Mr. Napolitano?
We have long battled over Indian water rights, and have approved very few of them in the 20 years I've been here. I think it's something that is not right, and we should look at it more, review it, in other words. Ms. Helen, would you like more time?
I really would just like to say one last thing, and that is, Mr. McClintock stated that these settlements are decided on a whim, and that is not true at all. I know people have spent their entire careers on working to settle water rights, and in fact, there are some going on in my state right now. It is not, I mean, you don't fly in and decide a water rights settlement and then fly out. It's something that takes a lot of time and negotiation, and anything that we put in front of that process to stall it or to make it more difficult for Indian tribes to claim the water that is theirs, I think that is a disservice from this committee.
Reclaiming my time, certainly we've had first 4 water rights, or 5 of them, back about 6 years ago, and it took a long time to get through to them. We haven't had many more after that. Somehow we have to be sure that we allow Native Americans to have the rightful rights to water and be able to serve them just like any other water rights agency that is not Native American. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else willing to comment on this? Mr. Gosar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As being one of those people that actually got one of the Indian water rights through, it was actually streamlined by the process that's so outlined. And, you know, we actually went through 3.5 in the WIN Act. And so I think from the standpoint of trying to mitigate this, you really have to have people concentrating the efforts. And particularly from the Arizona standpoint, and California and Colorado, and particularly on the Colorado Rivershed, very complex series of laws that predicate that discussion. And so I think from the standpoint of what Mr. McClintock has put out is a design that actually has facilitated some of those discussions and agreements. And so I would hope that my counterparts on the other side are not blinded by what superficially is here. It has actually worked. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? I concur and associate myself with my colleague from New Mexico's opposition to the amendment. It is many tribal communities are without potable water and treatment facilities, and this committee must pass these Indian water rights settlements. We're committed to moving Indian water rights settlements, and we'll work with Department of Justice and Department of Interior and our leadership to get that done. But overall, these requirements don't need to be in our rules. This amendment is not supported by Indian country, and I urge my colleagues to vote no on this. It's if we're going to right this wrong of these languishing water settlements that have not moved, and if we're going to live up to our trust responsibility, anything else in the rules that keeps us from that objective shouldn't be in there, and I'm opposed to it, and I urge a no vote. And with that, if there's no further debate, the question is on the McClintock amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? No. The noes have it. Roll call's been asked for. Recorded vote has been requested. The question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Bishop?
Mr. Chairman, where's my clicker so we can get this over?
We had technological complications. They hadn't put all the names of all the people that had come into the thing. It's
I click green.
That legacy apparatus will come back, Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano? Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Young? Mr. Costa? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomer votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal? Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Gosar votes aye. Mr. Cox? Mr. Cox votes no. Mr. Cook? Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes aye. Ms. Holland? Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Vandrew? Mr. Vandrew votes no. Mrs. Rodwagen? Mrs. Rodwagen votes aye. Mr. Cunningham? Mr. Cunningham votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes no. Ms. Cheney? Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Clay? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes aye. Ms. Dingle? Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Curtis? Mr. Curtis votes aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Hearn? Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mr. McEachin? Mr. McEachin votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Case? Mr. Case votes no. Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes no. Mr. San Nicolas?
Are there any members who wish to change their vote? Okay. The clerk shall report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 17 and the nays are 20.
The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment for consideration is designated Westerman number 1. Mr. Westerman, you are recognized to offer your amendment, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I've looked through the rules, and specifically the rules regarding the Federal Lands Subcommittee, I noticed that something was missing. There wasn't much language at all to do with our federal lands on the forestry side of it. We made some great strides, some bipartisan strides in getting more management on our federal lands. I think everyone here is aware of the recent fires that we've had, devastating fires, not only to our resources, but to communities and to human lives, actually. This is going to continue because we've got decades of mismanagement on our federal lands, and what my amendment would do would put more emphasis on management of those lands to continue with the process that we started in the previous Congress. And, there's also been a lot of talk about water here. Healthy forest is the best thing we can do to get better water quality, better water supply. It's not been in the news much lately, but where we've seen devastating wildfires last summer and fall, we're now seeing rains that are causing mudslides and filling our streams with silt and debris, which is not good for water quality or meeting those needs in places where people really have a tough time getting enough water. So the best thing we can do, and I think should be a major focus of this committee, is to continue to manage our forest, to get healthy forest. There's a lot of concern about carbon emissions in our country today. The forest in California and many other western states are actually net carbon emitters. And when we see major fires, we send a lot of carbon up into the atmosphere. So I think we should continue to focus on healthy forest initiatives, and that one of the main goals of that Public Lands Committee with our national parks and national forests is to make sure that those forests are healthy and resilient, that we're creating good air quality, good water quality, and also great wildlife habitat. So that's the purpose of my amendment, is to stress that we need to continue managing our federal lands.
Thank you very much. Any other member wish to be recognized on this amendment? Mr. Huffman?
I would like to work in this Congress with Mr. Westerman and others. I represent a lot of forest land in my district, and fires have impacted my district, and we want resilient, healthy forests, and in many areas we are in need of more active management. So there is a kernel of opportunity to work together on good policy, and I accept that as your intentions, Mr. Westerman, but it is extremely site-specific, and one of the disconnects we've had in the past is proposing some one-size-fits-all frameworks. To give you an example why that doesn't work, in a place like California, many of our worst fires take place in Southern California and Central California forests where there's no merchantable timber. And so to try to push quotas and logging into places where that just doesn't work is arbitrary, and it's a one-size-fits-all framework. In other places, the vegetation that needs to be removed is not merchantable. And so we're going to need to find other ways to make the economics work as we think about these treatments. It's very site-specific. So I will commit to working with Mr. Westerman and others, but I don't think it's a good idea to try to institutionalize and codify a one-size-fits-all framework in this committee rules. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Mr. Gosar? Mr. Gosar, can you?
Yes, thank you. Gentleman from Arkansas.
Thank you, Mr. Gosar. I agree with the gentleman. There's areas where there's not merchantable timber. The fires in Southern California, forest management wouldn't have helped prevent those fires. The ones in Northern California absolutely would have helped. And there's areas in northern, around the campfire where private land had been managed. There was still standing trees there. It was just much less dense vegetation. That's actually where the fire line stopped. We're facing a crisis in our country with our wildland-urban interfaces, and we need to be able to go in and specifically manage those wildland-urban interfaces. There's places where you can get manageable timber or marketable timber, and there's places where you can only get stuff that needs to be cut down and disposed of. And if we take the emphasis off forest management, which isn't always about getting merchantable timber, it's about doing what's best for the land and for the forest so that we get clean water and healthy forest, and we're not putting lives and property at stake. So that's the purpose of putting an emphasis on forest management for this committee. I yield back to Mr. Gosar.
I'd like to thank the gentleman, but also I don't think it implies to the gentleman from California that it's a one-size-fits-all. I think we've been very good, in particularly about trying to highlight different parts within that. And this is just one tool in the toolbox. I mean, for example, Coconino County asked us to insert on the good neighbor policy county's jurisdiction. And that's what I think that the gentleman is offering here, to make sure that we have all the tools in the toolbox to have available to us for all the different types of profiles that we may experience within the forestry. So I think it's a good amendment. I think that we ought to be including everything at our disposal. I thank the gentleman.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to, Mr. Napolitano?
I love the argument, but I still think we're not doing right by the Forest Service and providing them enough funding. I yield my time to Mr. Hudman.
I think we'll probably continue this debate as we struggle with policies and bills in the months ahead. I look forward to it. There is a kernel of, as I said, of consensus that I hope we can find, but I think institutionalizing it in the rules of this committee in a rather broad way and also an incomplete way. I don't see reference to controlled burns and other strategies that would need to be part of a thoughtful, comprehensive forest management policy. So my suggestion is that we work on this together as these bills and hearings go forward in the months ahead, and we leave the committee rules as they are.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? I certainly, Mr. Westerman, understand and support your desire to prioritize resilience in our forest. But I don't believe this amendment is an effective or useful way to do so. The language offered in the amendment, the substance of part of the discussion today, I think, is for a later date, with legislative initiatives and all the bills relative to the issue of forests go to the Public Lands Subcommittee now and will continue to do so. The language offered has never been in the committee rules before. My colleagues, I should note, have had the past 8 years in the majority to make this change. They chose not to. Furthermore, I'd like to point out that this amendment does not meet the spirit of the rules. Committee rules are to help the parliamentarian direct subcommittee bill referrals, and the rules are, as written, already accomplish that gentleman's purpose. Moreover, the gentleman is also offering it to the wrong rules package. Clarifying jurisdiction between committee requires an amendment to the House rules, not this committee's rules. And I can assure him that it's our priority in this majority, and that it will be included in our oversight plan as well to deal with the subject of forest resilience and what we need to do about it. I encourage him to work with us to keep our community safer and our forests healthier, and I'm happy to work with him as well. But on this amendment, I would urge a no vote and ask the clerk. I would ask any further debate. I hope not. All right. The question is on the Westerman amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. The noes have it. The noes have it. Recorded vote has been requested. The question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Westerman. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Bishop?
Aye.
Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano? Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Young? Mr. Costa? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal? Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Gosar votes aye. Mr. Cox? Mr. Cook? Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes aye. Ms. Holland? Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mrs. Radewagen? Mrs. Radewagen votes aye. Mr. Cunningham? Mr. Cunningham votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes no. Ms. Cheney? Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Clay? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Mrs. Dingle? Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Curtis? Mr. Curtis votes aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Hearn? Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mr. McEachin? Mr. McEachin votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Case? Mr. Case votes no. Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes no. Mr. San Nicolas?
Your vote or have not been recorded? Okay. If the clerk would please report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 17 and the nays are 19.
The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment for consideration is labeled as Bishop number 2. Mr. Bishop, you're recognized to offer your amendment, sir.
These are technical and grammatical changes. I understand the Democrats are willing to accept it.
Yes.
And if that, then there's no need to necessarily talk about it.
Thank you very much.
Yield back.
The question is on the Bishop amendment. There's no further debate. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment passes. Thank you. The next amendment for consideration is labeled as Bishop number 3. Mr. Bishop, your amendment, sir?
I'm not offering that. This is,
Because of Mr. Graves' amendment, so he's not going to offer it.
Oh,
Okay,
Mr. Graves filed that late.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
We have to pass that out then.
So that'll be at the end, or do you want Mr. Graves to offer it now?
Is Mr. Graves ready?
Garrett, are you ready for this amendment now?
Okay, let's pass it out.
Let's pass it out.
Can we pass it out?
So the next,
Can you explain that this was offered as a bishop and now it's offered as a Graves amendment?
this amendment was initially offered as a Bishop amendment, and now it's offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana as that amendment. So the next amendment under consideration is labeled as Graves 2. And Mr. Graves, you're recognized for your amendment, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, just want to quickly say that you've made it clear that part of the agenda of this committee over the next several weeks is going to be climate change hearings and potential legislation. As I understand, you all have scheduled 7 climate change hearings in upcoming weeks. As this committee moves forward, and if that's an issue area where we're going to be legislating, I think it's important that the analysis of legislation include an analysis of the economic implications of the legislation. What are the positive and negative impacts on the economy? What are the positive and negative impacts on jobs? What are the positive and negative impacts on revenues, including tax revenues for our local and state governments? And just to ensure that we don't make decisions that are too myopic or unbalanced, and that we're able to take a comprehensive view at legislation that we're considering, and that we take all factors into consideration as we move these bills forward. So once again, net effect on the economy for the geographic area impacted the creation or the retention of jobs, tax revenues. In addition, looking at the quantification of greenhouse gas emissions directly affected by the legislation. And Mr. Chairman, having spent a little time on this issue in the past, I know that there were well-intentioned initiatives that may have absolutely resulted in a reduction in domestic emissions, but likely would have resulted in an increase in global emissions. And so I believe that this is important information for us to make truly informed, balanced decisions moving forward. I want to make note, Mr. Chairman, that I represent South Louisiana. We are I think the canary in the coal mine when it comes to sea rise and coastal sustainability challenges. This is an important issue for the district that I represent, and I want to make sure that when we're moving forward, we're doing it in an informed manner. Thank you.
Anyone, any other member wish to be recognized in this particular amendment? Recognizing myself, I oppose the amendment. This amendment would delay our work by adding a burdensome requirement that would not improve the legislation or committee reports. House rules already require committee reports to include economic analysis developed independently by the Congressional Budget Office. To require additional analysis written by the staff of the committee, I think, is redundant and unnecessary. The concern for economic impacts, if that may escape the analysis of CBO, I would suggest that the minority has absolute ability under the rules to make sure that witnesses are invited to our hearings to talk about those exactly. The other point I think is important to note is that I think one silver lining in the amendment is that it includes climate change indicators in this amendment. Considering your party's long history of denying that climate change exists, this is a welcome, what did you call it? Nugget? Had this requirement been in place under the former majority, I guess this section of the committee report would have just been blank. But again, we will rely on hearings to describe these impacts and not slow down our legislative process with new requirements for report language. And I think delaying the work of this committee on this very critical and important issue of climate change that is our majorities, not only in this committee, but overall, one of the top priorities. I don't think that this amendment would do anything to assure that we get to that goal. And so I would urge a no vote on the amendment. And
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman?
Sir.
I appreciate the chairman's comments, but the issue is not the speed with which we deal with issues around here, but that we get it right. This is a common sense amendment, and it's stunning to me that we would not consider the impact that bills would have on the economy and individuals and taxpayers. I think this is very much common sense, and I want to yield some more time to the gentleman from Louisiana.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the sensitivity, and I am not a fan of bureaucracy by any stretch, and have worked for several years to try and streamline government at the state and federal levels, and I'm going to continue to do that. Compounding or heaping on Mr. Heiss's comments, Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't call an evaluation of job impacts and livelihoods burdensome, which I believe is a word that was used. I don't believe that. Going to a family and saying, I'm sorry, you're going to lose your job, or this industry is going to be leaving your community, and perhaps it's something that's been done in that community for generations. I think it's informative. And also, Mr. Chairman, the attempt here, and I want to be clear, I'm not a climate change denier. I believe the climate is changing. I've said it in this committee several times. I've voted with the other side of the aisle on this issue on occasion, and I will continue to do that when the policies make sense. Mr. Chairman, if we're going to move forward on legislation that is intended to benefit the environment, that is intended to address climate change concerns, that I think then asking for a quantification. What is the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are reduced by the legislation? The effect on sea rise, the acres of wildlife habitat preserved, the reduction in global temperature resulting from the legislation, and potential cost savings from pre-disaster mitigation, whether it be fires, hurricanes, or others. What is the benefits of leaning forward and being proactive versus being reactive? Mr. Chairman, this is going to affect two types of districts, those that have had disasters and those that will, which means every single one of us. This isn't intended to sandbag the process. It's intended to ensure that we're moving forward with accurate information and that we are moving in the right direction. And lastly, I mentioned this before, but I think it's worth reiterating. some of the actions we take here could have profound revenue consequences on our local governments, on our states, and on this nation. And I think that that needs to be part of the overall equation. In some cases, those adverse consequences may be worth it. So with that, I urge adoption of the amendment. Yield back to Mr. Heiss.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Lowenthal.
Well, I want to thank Mr. Graves for bringing this amendment up. While I will not be supportive of the amendment, because I agree with you, this may not be the best way, I think that the underlying presumption that that legislation on climate change will have impacts upon the creation and retention of jobs. I think you're right. Will have net impacts on revenue. I think you're right. I would hope that in my subcommittee that we can work together to raise some of these issues and deal with it. I think you're absolutely right. I don't think this is the best way to do that by putting in an extra step, but I thank you for at least raising this issue, and I commit to you I'd like to work with you on those issues.
Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Lumbrough and Mr. Andrew.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Lowenthal, I hope you both agree that this is an important issue to discuss whenever bills are put forward as having an impact on global climate change, or the levels of the sea rise, or temperatures, and so on. So we may end up voting this down for the reasons that you cited. You think it's too cumbersome, but I hope you would agree that this is an important discussion to have when those bills come forward, and the quantification, and I think Mr. Graves has really put his finger on what's really important. The quantification is something that we absolutely should look at. So I hope we have agreement on that concept as we go forward.
Mr. Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would say the same. I won't vote for this today, but as these discussions happen, I think you bring out really good points, not only on some of the costs and how they affect other industries and businesses, but even in the costs and how they affect people and their utility bills and what's going to happen. We've had discussions, I know, in our state, because everything around me is coastal. I'm in the coastal part of New Jersey. And, you know, as we're doing windmills and we're going forward, and I believe that we should, and I firmly believe in climate change, I think we have to be very mindful of the people, their jobs, their ability to pay their bills because of the changes that we make. And this is a discussion that should always be had. We shouldn't just be speaking in the theoretical and the scientific. We also have to really speak in the sociological and how we are dealing with people and their lives and how they're going to be able to spend their lives. So it's very, very important, and I hope that we can continue to have this conversation because I think it's one worth having.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Horsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to say I'm glad that we will be having hearings on climate change, and that issue should be something that's germane to this committee. However, I want to point out that when it comes to the issue around budget and revenue implications, the jurisdiction of those topics will be covered by other committees in our body. And I think the rules for that are covered in the House rules, and we shouldn't limit ourselves at the committee level. So I don't think that this particular amendment by Mr. Graves, while well-intentioned, I don't think that it achieves its purpose because those rules are addressed by the House, and the jurisdiction around budget and revenue will be handled by other committees of jurisdiction.
The gentleman yield.
I should note that we're going to be called to vote very soon, and I was hoping that we could call it a day when we go to vote, but we need to move the process along. I don't want to quash any discussion, but recessing and coming back is I don't think the favorite thing on anybody's agenda in the room right now. So, Mr. Soto.
Mr. Chairman, just briefly, I believe with 7 committee hearings on this subject, we'll be able to exhaust all these excellent questions with this brilliant, august body here asking and bringing forth facts. And so I think we're going to have a robust debate over each and every one of these issues. I have my absolute confidence.
Let me call for the question on this item. No further debate. The question is on Graves Amendment number 3. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. The noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment fails. Thank you. The next amendment for consideration is labeled as Bishop number 4. Mr. Bishop, you're recognized, sir.
Okay, this amendment goes to what you just witnessed here, because most of the conversation you had were totally unscripted. And it was actually a conversation. In the early days of Congress, we used to have proxy voting, which simply meant that you all gave your proxy to the chair, and then when the vote came, he or she pulled out as many proxies as was necessary to win the vote. We abandoned that in the 1990s and instead came up with roll voting, which is the same thing except with lipstick on it. In roll voting, you have a discussion that basically no one is there for, and then bring everyone back in for a rolled vote. Let me give you a specific example. Back last time, and there's only 6 people in here that would be around for that. We had, Mr. Raul had a major mining bill. I was the ranking Republican at that time because I was the only Republican in the room. I was outvoted because there were 2 Democrats in the room, Raul and Abercrombie. We had a wonderful discussion on every possible amendment to that mining bill, the 3 of us. And because Rahal was a nice guy, Abercrombie especially, we probably could have worked out some kind of deals very easily. But we didn't. We just did the discussion to no one hearing the discussion. And then we had the call for the rolled votes, in which case everyone came in here looking very concerned about what they were doing, except for the guy from New York who can never find his seat. Still over there, but he could never find his seat. And looked serious, which is either true or you all had hemorrhoids, but you looked serious and looked at the vote of the votes coming up, and then you voted with or against the chairman, depending on which point of view, which party you happen to be there, without knowing anything. Rolled votes are one of the things that is bad about this body, procedurally, on the floor, as well as here. For efficiency, which they are, you give up knowledge. It's one of the reasons I refused to have rolled votes in the last couple of sessions, because at least you were here to hear the amendments and debate on the bill before you actually voted. And if you roll them, you're not going to show up. If you don't know when it's going to happen, you're going to be here for it. Every legislative body, at least what I had association with in Utah, the expectation where you were in committees at the same time, you were on the floor at the same time, you heard the discussion, and there was a flow to the debate, as you just witnessed here, where nobody had prepared speeches and they were here because they needed to be. That was the goal. Now, I know the chairman has said he wants to have voting in real time, but has also reserved the opportunity of having rolled votes. In my opinion, a procedure. Rolled votes is one of the most detrimental factors that we have in Congress, and it encourages the lack of participation, the lack of listening, the lack of understanding. So the goal is voting, not in actually listening or hearing or debating. This amendment would strike that section that would allow for rolled votes and simply say, we're going to vote in real time, everyone will be here, you'll have that chance to actually converse. Yield back.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to address this amendment? The ability of the chair to postpone recorded votes provides critical flexibility and should remain an option in our rules, as they have under the previous majorities. The fact that Mr. Bishop did not utilize the roll vote, that option that's his choice, but that choice needs to remain in the rules. We would be one, if only, committee that would not have that flexibility in the rules. We can proceed with recorded votes in real time, and we will continue to urge every member to be here for that. But for scheduling and other reasons, the option of postponing votes should always remain part of the prerogative.
Would the chairman yield?
You know, I don't know what the adage is, something about it's good for the goose, it should be good for the gander, and I think we're kind of in that situation, but I'd be glad to yield to the ranking member.
Like, I'll make you a deal. If you guarantee that you'll try to do voting in real time and totally minimize the idea of rolled votes, I'll withdraw the amendment.
No, that's a good offer, and I would I would accept that, and
All right, I'll withdraw.
amendments withdrawn.
Can I say one other thing in addition? Ms. Dingle, it's your husband's fault. He is purported to have said, if I let you do the policy and you let me do the procedure, I'll screw you every time. This is about procedure.
And you have my commitment of earnest effort to have all real-time votes.
All right.
But if and when that's not possible, still have that option in the rules. The next amendment for consideration is labeled Bishop number 5. Mr. Bishop?
I am doing one other thing here to try and help us that we actually have debate. And the last one we had, the debate recently, you were all talking. You were all speaking to what somebody had said. None of you had scripted out your comments. It was the right thing to do. This prohibits us from reading speeches in this committee. Before 1919, it was illegal to read anything on the floor. In 1919, somebody asked for the right to read a letter into the record, and it has been downhill ever since that time. So that now we have faced a situation on the floor, as well as in committees, where the staff wrote a speech, come hell or high water, I'm going to give that speech, and I really don't care what happened before or after. Once again, when there is communication going on in most state legislators, they are there, and there is actually a flow to the debate because people are responding. Reading speeches inhibits that opportunity. I'm not going to say anything because I have noticed that Mr. Grijalva has a tendency of doing this, but I have watched him over the time. He edits his crap as he's going through it. I will give you a simple example of why I'm saying that. We had one member who is no longer here, has been gone for a long time, so I can use him without mentioning his name, but with impunity, whose staff insisted he would be much more powerful if he gave his question with a written question. He read his question to the witness. So he started questioning the witness. And in his 5 minutes, he spent 3.5 minutes of his speech/question, but was not really good at punctuation. So when he came to the question mark, he simply blew through it, and in his rhetoric said, and when the witness says yes, then you ask, oops, sorry. That's part of the record. It would not happen if we did not simply give a read speech. Now, I also mentioned this earlier because the first thing we did in here was the colloquy, and I read my stuff in the colloquy, and you notice how damn boring that was, and none of you paid attention to it, which is exactly what happens when we read speeches in committee. Mr. Chairman, I'll withdraw the amendment.
I was just about to read mine, but
I saved you. I saved you.
Mr. Chairman, just for the record, in 1919, we couldn't read in Louisiana.
Mr. Graves, you're trying to move the meeting along.
And the reason that we like to do it now.
Next
is
amendment for
it's show off.
consideration is labeled as Bishop number 6, excuse me. Mr. Bishop, you're recognized.
This is the most significant one. It will ban the use of the term bedrock from any discussions we have in this chamber. There is no such thing as bedrock, unless you're referring to the Flintstones, and then it's allowed. There is no such thing as bedrock legislation by anyone other than litigators who want to sue somebody.
Would the gentleman yield for a friendly amendment to his amendment?
Maybe. Try me.
I would be open to that if the gentleman would accept a similar change. It seems like on the other side of the aisle, the word environmentalist is invariably preceded by the word radical. There is no such thing, as far as I can tell, as an environmentalist, only radical environmentalists. So perhaps if we purged radical...
Be careful, I'm willing to accept
that. We might just take things to a higher plane.
We'll just change them to special interest group. Well, I'd accept that. You'll vote for it, I'll accept it.
Anyone else? Mr. Gallego.
Mr. Grijalva, I think we should actually table this for now in lieu of the fact that officially today the city of Bedrock, Arizona is shutting down. And I think, to observe at least a moment of silence for this great city. Thank you.
Anyone else willing to? In opposition?
Wait, I withdraw it.
Oh, I was going to speak to the First Amendment in our bedrock Constitution, but...
No, that's
an
an inspired document, not a bedrock document. I'll call you out anytime you use bedrock, though.
The next amendment for consideration, Mr. Curtis, number 1. Mr. Curtis, you're recognized.
Thank you. I had intended to read my speech here, but in deference to the ranking member.
We still have it under the rules.
Oh, good. I'd like to thank the chairman and ranking member for letting me offer this amendment. To me, this amendment is very simple. If Congress holds a hearing or a markup on a bill that affects federal land, and that bill is not sponsored or co-sponsored by a member who's in that district, who represents that district, then the chairman must give 7 days public notice. Additionally, if a hearing is held, that member must be invited to participate in the hearing. To me, this is as common sense as it gets, and giving a member a 1-week notice of legislation happening in their district almost seems to not even need explanation for the reasons. Our constituents need to have a voice, and we are their elected representatives. We need every advantage in representing them and giving them that word. This amendment is important to ensure serious debate, transparency in the committee, and I believe it's not only important for us, but it's far more important for our 400 colleagues who aren't part of this committee. And I yield my time.
Wishes to also comment? Ms. Holland?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I respectfully oppose this amendment to add new notification and invitation requirements whenever the committee considers legislation related to public lands in a member's district, if that member is not a sponsor or co-sponsor of the bill. While I am new to this committee, it is my understanding that this has never been a part of the committee rules, even under the last 8 years of Republican leadership. That's because it's not a problem or a significant issue that needs to be addressed in the committee rules. There are clear and consistent notification requirements in the House rules, and we should be able to trust each other and know that members will coordinate with their colleagues. To that end, members are routinely granted unanimous consent to participate in our hearings, a practice that I certainly plan to continue as chair of the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands. When it comes to markups, this language could potentially apply to almost every bill we consider, potentially doubling existing notification requirements. So while I appreciate the sentiment of this amendment, this seems like it is more about trying to gum up the works than actually trying to make the committee operate in a more fair and transparent manner. I am from New Mexico, a state with a significant amount of public lands, and I understand how sensitive and even divisive land management issues can be. But I want to assure my Republican colleagues that there is no secret plan to advance legislation without their knowledge or participation. We are committed to operating this committee in a transparent and open manner. And just reiterate that I respectfully oppose this proposal.
Thank you. Anyone else wishes to address this amendment? Seeing no one,
May I respond?
please.
While I understand...
Wait. Recognize me.
Yes, I
Bishop?
would first like to...
I yield.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I understand that the intent is good to notify, and I understand that it likely would happen. But fundamentally, we are here to represent our constituents, and the possibility that legislation could be underway without notification or without proper time to respond to the constituents back home is troubling. I, too, have a district, and 5 of my 7 counties have 90% federal land. And some of them are the most difficult issues in the country. One of my base responsibilities is to be aware of what's happening and anticipate what's happening and be able to respond for them. These are not difficult requirements that we're asking. These are very common sense requirements that shouldn't be a high bar for anybody. I yield my time.
Let me come back and say I actually support this again. We try to do this internally, but having this down as a rule would be beneficial, would be positive, and would force us to make sure that we're looking out for other people before we start piddling around in their particular areas, and that they get that kind of chance for that input. So this is one of the things we didn't do before, but it's a darn good idea. We ought to have done it before, and I urge you to actually do it now while we have the rules before us. Now I yield back.
Sablan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just out of curiosity, I'd like to probably work with Mr. Curtis because I cannot count the number of legislation that are introduced in Congress that actually applies to the territories without consultation to the members, or it doesn't apply to the territories. And we tried to ask the question if we could include a requirement that anything having to do with any bill should have an explanation why it won't apply to a territory or why it would. We didn't get anywhere with that because I'm just making members aware that they do it and pull the rock from under us all the time. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Graves?
Mr. Chairman, if Mr. Sablon and a few other folks, or Mr. Cunningham, perhaps Mr. Van Drew, I was going to second degree this and add something that made it clear that adjacent federal waters would also be included. If a few of y'all want to go renegade and actually vote for this thing, we can all have fun. Otherwise, I won't waste people's time.
Anyone else wish to address?
If I could, Mr. Chair. Look, the spirit of this is something I think we all agree on. We don't want people to be blindsided and surprised, especially when things are critically important to the constituents they represent. And I have felt that way in the past. I've had things sprung on me with very little notice. I think as a practice, as a matter of courtesy, we should always endeavor to give a heads up to our colleagues regardless of their party affiliation, and that will certainly be the practice that I try to implement in chairing my subcommittee on water, oceans, and wildlife. But to codify such a hardline advance notice requirement would really complicate a lot of the work that we try to do.
Will the gentleman yield? I'd like to just point out that there is an end run to this, and that is to get that member to be a co-sponsor. I just want to point out that that is the ultimate goal, is that you would work with that member to the point that they would support that bill and co-sponsor it. I yield.
Anyone else wish to address this amendment? The amendment's redundant. It's in the House rules about notification. But more importantly, I think the practice of this committee will be notification and inclusion in that process, as other members have mentioned. And so I think that this rule is consistent with the House rules. And if there's no further debate, the question is on the Curtis Amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. Recorded vote has been requested, and the question now occurs in agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman, Mr. Curtis. The clerk should call the roll, please.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Bishop? Aye. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano? No. Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Young? Mr. Costa? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. Whitman? Mr. Lowenthal? Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Gosar? Aye. Mr. Gosar votes aye. Mr. Cox? No. Mr. Cox votes no. Mr. Cook? Aye. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes aye. Ms. Holland? Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Van Drew?
Mr. Chairman, could you yield just a moment of time? There's just a few words I wanted to say before I vote. Not at this time? Okay. No.
Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mrs. Radowagen? Mrs. Radowagen votes aye. Mr. Cunningham? Mr. Cunningham votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes no. Ms. Cheney? Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Clay? Ms. Gonzalez Colon? Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Mrs. Dingle? Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Curtis? Mr. Curtis votes aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Hearn? Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mr. McEachin? Mr. McEachin votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Case? Mr. Case votes no. Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes no. Mr. San Nicolas?
Wishes to change their vote? Seeing none, the clerk shall report the vote when she's done counting.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the ayes are 16 and the nays are 20.
The amendment is not agreed. It's not agreed to. Any other amendments at this point from members? The question is now on final passage of the rules package as amended. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? Nay. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The rules are adopted, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The last item of consideration is the appointment of Democratic and Republican committee staff under the House rules, which is in your folders. Without objection, committee staff is appointed. I ask now for unanimous consent the staff be allowed to make any technical and conforming changes to the rules and the document of the committee just adopted, subject to approval by the minority. Hearing no objections, so order. If there's no further business, thank you for your patience and for being here at the committee hearing for the entire length. With that, and I'm glad the staff is appointed because I need stuff to read at the next meeting. With that, let me adjourn the committee meeting. Thank you.